and nobles. Well, that's been forgotten, so nobody talks about that anymore. And that's a very serious problem, because in fact, the failure to attend to the commons is going to destroy us. That's the environmental crisis, which we're marching towards with utter abandon. If some extraterrestrial observer was watching, I think we're all lunatics. But it's going on right now. And unless this conception of preservation of the commons and the values that were part of it, unless that's restored, we're in trouble. Well, shortly after that, with the beginnings of capitalist industrialization, there's a move towards making everything a commodity, and it then becomes necessary to inculcate the new spirit of the age, gain wealth for getting all but self, and reverence for what Adam Smith condemned as the vile maxim. Actually, there are major industries devoted to it. The public relations industry, advertising, marketing, it's probably a sixth of gross national domestic product, is devoted pretty much to this. It's devoted very consciously. Interesting to read the literature, their own literature. It's devoted to create what's called creating wants, fancied needs, stimulating consumerism, turning people's attention to what are called the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption, and away from real human values. And enormous work goes into this. Keep people from our throats again. That new spirit of the age is so inhuman, so that over 150 years of effort, there still is always resistance. So in the early 1970s, as kind of an outgrowth of 1960s activism, there was a very important series of labor strikes, most young workers mostly, many of them Vietnam veterans, others just young people getting into the workforce. The most famous one was at Lordstown, and striking very significantly. They were not striking particularly for wages and benefits, but for dignity, for human dignity in the workplace. That was also the time when women were becoming organized and active, and Chicanos, farm workers, black unions, and so on. All of this was beaten back, and it's been beaten back for a generation, but it's there. In fact, the Occupy movements that are spreading all over are reviving it. And a lot, I think it's their main significance, and a lot hinges on whether the new spirit of the age, 150 years old, whether it can be, and in fact in England going back centuries, the destruction of the commons, it's very important to determine whether this new spirit can be overcome. If not, we're just lemmings walking off the cliff, and soon. There's a lot to say about that, but I'll put it aside. Well, again, after World War II, going back to that, there was another new spirit, a spirit of triumphalism. Before the Second World War, the United States was a kind of a cultural, intellectual backwater. If you wanted to study science or philosophy or the arts or to be a writer, you went to Europe, Germany, Britain, France, someplace like that. But after World War II, that all changed. And it led to just a different attitude. I mean, I remember it very well. I was just becoming a college student at the time. The atmosphere was that we should shed all of this old world baggage and lead the world to a bright future, what was called an American century. European scholars, many of whom were emigrating here, fleeing Nazi Germany, they were feared because they were too good, and they were disdained because that's the old-fashioned baggage, and the two were at the same time. There were many very ugly incidents. I could tell you about some of them, which I remember. From a student perspective, like what I was in the 1940s, in philosophy, linguistics, psychology. You just had to start afresh, disregard all of this old nonsense from Europe, biology too, in fact. Forget it all, don't talk about it, and start from the beginning. You know, we're going to create a new age. And a lot of contempt and a lot of ignorance. And there are many consequences, some of them right to the present. It's very striking in the behavioral sciences, in fact, but also elsewhere. There were also changes at that time, crucial changes, in the nature, in the way the economy functioned, and the state role in the economy, which had a huge impact on the universities, higher education particularly. You go back to the colonial period, Adam Smith gave advice to the colonies, the greatest economist of the day, and the advice he gave was the standard prescriptions that the World Bank and the IMF and the US Treasury and others give to the poor countries today. You know, pursue your comparative advantage, don't try to import higher manufactured goods, more advanced goods from the advanced countries, and so don't try to control your resources. Everything will be better if you do that. Well, the United States was independent by that time, so they were able to totally reject the rules of what are called sound economics. And they did. If we had accepted them, we'd be a third world country. But in fact, that's how the third world was pretty much created. But the colonies could reject it. The so-called Hamiltonian system introduced very high tariffs to block superior British manufacturers. There was a lot of stealing of technology, what's now called piracy. And the United States began to develop. And this went from textiles, the early stages of industrialization, right through steel, and on pretty much till the Second World War. There was a huge role of the state system in state sector in developing the economy. Mass industrialization was developed, for example, in armories, because there you could control things. The railroad system was managed by the Army Corps of Engineers and so on. Well, after World War II, that took a major leap forward, huge. There was massive funding for science and technology, mostly through the Pentagon. And it was done through the Pentagon for the usual reasons. You have to inspire fear. And you can get taxpayers to, pay the Pentagon to protect us from various imaginary dangers. But the money that went through the Pentagon ended up creating the high-tech economy that we're now living in. So computers, internet, satellites, microelectronics, a whole array of stuff comes out of decades of mostly Pentagon funding and research. My own university, MIT, was right in the middle of it. The net effect is to socialize cost and to privatize profit. And it's a standard device. Interstate highway systems, another example. It's not what it's claimed to be. It was sold on the basis of defense. It was really part of the mass subsidy to automobiles, energy corporations, rubber corporations. Turned us into the idea was to make us a society that massively wastes fossil fuels, with consequences we're now in the middle of. There was also a rapid expansion of the student body through the GI Bill, which brought a whole new sector of the population into higher education, people who never could have gone before. That had a very positive impact on the colleges and on the general society. That's incidentally a course that's been reversed in the last generation. I'll come back to it. The sharp increase in funding was mainly directed to science and technology, but of course there was a spillover into other domains. 1957, the Russians sent a satellite into space, Sputnik, and there were laments about how the U.S. is falling behind, going to be destroyed and so on. The scientific community knew that this was total nonsense, that there was just, the achievement was essentially nothing. We could duplicate it and go way beyond it anytime we wanted to, but it was exploited. It was exploited pretty cynically, I should say. I remember it very well. And it was exploited to give an enormous additional input into higher education and also K to 12. That's when you get the start of the kinds of things that Alberts is deploring, like new math, for example. I have to say, I had young kids at that time. We had very amusing experiences with watching my young children, 10-year-old children, try to learn new math from teachers who didn't understand a word about the set theoretic basis for it, but were trying to teach it. And the kids were kind of making up their own. I'll just give you one example. When my youngest daughter was, I don't know, maybe 10 or so, I had a visit from a friend, an Israeli logician, who's an old friend, Yehoshua Bar Hillel, some of you know. He came, stayed with us for a while, and he saw my daughter doing her work in what was called Boolean algebra. It was called set theory, actually, Boolean algebra. And he was interested because he'd been trying to teach it to junior high school students in Israel, and they're having a hard time doing it, and she seemed to be doing it fine. So we started asking her questions, like, if you have three things, how many sets are there? You know, like a milk bottle and a cup and a book or something. And she said right off, 8 sets. And then he asked, then he asked her to list them. She listed them all, including the null set. And he asked, which set is included in all the others? She said, the null set. And then I couldn't believe it. So I asked her, how do you know the null set is included in all the others? So she said, well, to have a set, what you do is draw braces and you put the things inside it. And if you look carefully, there's always a little space between them. That's where the null set goes. So what in fact had happened is she was doing something quite sensible. She was making up a physical model which happened to work for these principles, and of course that had absolutely nothing to do with what they were trying to teach her. And this was going on all the time. That's no child left behind. Well, in the 60s, there were major changes, major social, cultural changes. The civil rights movement moves towards diversity, women's rights, all sorts of things. And the universities were greatly enriched by that, as indeed was the whole society. By the end of the 60s, there was also a fair amount of political activism developing, and it became a major force. So again, at my own university, MIT, mainly science university, it had been extremely conservative and passive right through the 60s. People were absorbed in their work. But by the end of the 60s, by 1969, activism had gotten to the point that a day was set aside formally to just consider the question of, for the whole institute, to consider the question of the role of technology in society. Amazingly, a question that had never been asked. You just do it. And that led to a lot of consequences, which in fact have changed brought about a permanent change in the Institute, and similar things were happening in other places. This was even abroad too. It's a general movement. And it had a real civilizing effect on the whole society. Well, that civilizing effect of the 1960s aroused deep concerns all across the mainstream spectrum. That's why it's usually called the time of troubles. It was civilizing the country too much, and that's dangerous. And it's kind of interesting I'll talk a little about the reaction. It has effects, very strong effects right to the present. On the right, one striking example was an influential memorandum, which it's worth reading. You can pick it up on the internet. A memorandum by Lewis Powell, who was a corporate lawyer. He was later appointed by Nixon to the Supreme Court. At the other end of the spectrum, there's an important study, also worth reading, by the Trilateral Commission. These are liberal internationalists from the 3 major industrial regions, Europe, United States, and Japan. Their general outlook is indicated by the fact that the Carter administration was drawn almost completely from their ranks. That's who they were. And both of them merit attention. They provide a good insight into the ideological aspects of what has in fact been a major assault on democracy and on rights that was beginning to take shape 40 years ago, escalated pretty sharply in the Reagan-Thatcher years and continued, and it's now reaching new heights. And they also provide insight into how this assault targets the educational system. So let's start with Powell's memorandum, 1971. This was sent to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. That's the main business lobby. The title was "The Attack on the American Free Enterprise System." And it's worth reading, not only for the content, but also for the tone, which is totally paranoid, which is characteristic. The major criminals were Ralph Nader, with his consumer safety campaigns, Herbert Marcuse, who was preaching Marxism, new leftists are on the rampage, but primarily they're naive victims who dominate the universities, the schools, television and other media, the educated community, and virtually control the government. If you haven't noticed it, I'm incidentally not exaggerating. That's exactly what it said. I urge you to read it. Well, the takeover of the country by these devils is a dire threat to freedom, he said, because the only alternatives to free enterprise are varying degrees of bureaucratic regulation of individual freedom, ranging from moderate socialism to the leftist and rightist dictatorships. Actually, if any of you are watching the Republican debates, the same thing is being repeated right now, you know. The center-right Obama administration are Marxist radicals and so on. Actually, Powell was very familiar with another alternative to free enterprise, namely the system in which he and his Chamber of Commerce associates thrived. He was an influential lobbyist for the tobacco industry, and he was surely aware of the huge federal subsidies for the production of this leading killer, which not only kills users at a scale that vastly exceeds the targets of the mostly farcical drug wars, but also kills many others. Deaths from passive smoking, so collateral damage, you know, just being around when somebody's smoking, way beyond those from hard drugs. And he was surely aware of the great successes of lobbyists like him in assuring that for many decades the government would help not only subsidize the industry, but help it conceal what they all knew. They knew about the lethal product that they were peddling, and there are huge mounds of corpses to show for their achievement. They're still piling up rapidly. But that didn't keep him from wailing in his memo that, I'll quote, "As every business executive knows, few elements of American society today have as little influence in government as the American businessman, corporation, even the millions of corporate stockholders," in case you hadn't noticed. And that, again, is pretty characteristic. And the reason is that there's an assumption that for the state to support, subsidize private power, that's just the natural order. Any disruption of it is a catastrophe. And he then drew the obvious conclusion. He was talking about the universities. He said the campuses from which much of this emanates are supported by tax funds generated largely from American business and contributions from capital funds controlled or generated by American business. The boards of trustees of our universities overwhelmingly are composed of men and women who are leaders in the business system. Most of the media, including the national TV systems, are owned and theoretically controlled by corporations which depend on profits and the enterprise system to survive. And therefore, these marginalized groups who are being destroyed should organize to defend themselves instead of just watching passively while business and our fundamental freedoms are destroyed by this Marxist onslaught from the media and the universities. Well, Powell's memo expresses the concerns elicited by 1960s activism at the right end of the mainstream spectrum. But much more revealing, I think, is the reaction at the opposite extreme, the liberal internationalists. And these are spelled out in the Trilateral Commission report that I mentioned. It's called The Crisis of Democracy. It's not easy to find, incidentally, because they mostly took it off the market when people started reading it. But it's there. Actually, I should say that at MIT, as soon as I read it when it came out, and I figured this isn't going to last very long, so I bought a lot of copies from the MIT library. So if you can't find one, the MIT library has maybe a dozen or so copies. And then it did go out of print, I should say, very quickly. The crisis of democracy that they were talking about is literally that there's too much democracy. The problem, they said, this is leading figures, major political scientists from Harvard and so on. The public, the way that the democratic order is supposed to work, the public is supposed to be passive and apathetic. The Lippmann, Bernays, Emerson, Madison model, or Hume. They're supposed to be passive, apathetic, but in the 60s they were beginning to organize to press their demands. That's what was being done by what are called the special interests. The special interests are women, young people, old people, workers, farmers, the population, in other words. They're the special interests. If you look through and when they press their demands, there's too much pressure on the state. The state can't deal with them. So therefore, they have to moderate their demands. Now, there's one group that isn't mentioned, the corporate sector. And that makes sense because they represent the national interest, not special interest. So just like the far right, the liberal internationalists assume that their extraordinary power and their control of the state and other institutions is just the natural order. A primary concern of the trilateral scholars, just like Lewis Powell, was the failures of what they called, I'm quoting, the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young, the schools, the universities, the churches, and the like. They're not carrying out their duty to indoctrinate the young properly, and that's why we had this time of troubles. In general, they said we have to have more moderation in democracy if the national interest is to be protected, including much more successful indoctrination of the young. Well, the Powell memo and the trilateral study spell out the concerns at the opposite extremes of the dominant ideological spectrum. These are largely shared concerns, and they've led to vigorous action to restore order, as has often happened in the past. One consequence of these and other developments has been a pretty sharp attack on public education, taking many forms. I'll mention a few. About a year ago, I went to Mexico to give talks at the National University, UNAM. Quite a good university. It's a very poor country, of course, but quite a good, impressive university. High standards, good faculty, lively discussion, reasonable facilities, not like a rich American university, but quite reasonable. I also visited a city university. There's a city university in Mexico City, which, incidentally, UNAM is free, no tuition. About 10 years ago, there was an attempt by the government to raise just very low tuition. That led to a national student strike. The country's practically closed down. The government withdrew the proposal. There actually still on the UNAM campus is an administration building that was occupied at the time and is still occupied, and it's used as a kind of activism center. The city university is not only free, but has open admissions with compensatory options for those who need them. And it's also pretty respectable. I was quite impressed to see it. Well, I went from Mexico to California, maybe the richest place in the world. There, the public education system, which is just the best public education system in the world, is being destroyed. It's being privatized for the rich, of course. For the rest, some level of mostly technical training. And it's quite a contrast between a poor country and, in many ways, the richest place in the world. And that's happening all across the country. So in most states, like here I just heard before, in most states, tuition covers more than half of college budgets. That's also true of most public research universities. Pretty soon, only the community colleges will be state-financed, and even they are under attack. I'm quoting a recent study. Analysts generally agree that the era of affordable four-year public universities, subsidized by the state, may be over. That's one important way to implement indoctrination of the young, for a very good, simple reason. Students leave in a debt trap. When you have a college debt has reached the astonishing level of over $1 trillion now. When a student leaves college with a big debt, they don't have many options. Indoctrination is working. That's true of social control generally. It's also an important feature of international policy. Well, as the Mexico-California comparison illustrates, the reasons for the conscious destruction of the greatest public education system in the world in California and comparable things elsewhere, the reasons are not economic. There are many other cases, including rich societies, so Germany, to mention one, or for that matter, the post-war U.S. experience. Much poorer country than we are now, but it wasn't totally free, but tuition was very low. So, for example, when I went to the University of Pennsylvania as an undergraduate, it was literally $100 a year. That might be $400 today. It's not an economic reason, but as a technique of indoctrination, it's very valuable. Well, if they're not publicly supported, how are universities going to survive? They don't produce commodities for profit, and that's the dominant value under the new spirit of the age. The funding issue raises many troubling issues. These would not arise if fostering independent thought and inquiry were regarded as a public good, as in the Enlightenment model, that is, as having intrinsic value. The traditional ideal of the universities, however flawed in practice, and there are major attempts to change that. So crossing the ocean, in Britain, the right-wing government is now challenging what's been for a century called the Haldane principle. It's a century-old principle that barred government intrusion into academic research. Whether they'll succeed in overturning it, I don't know. And there's another kind of assault on intellectual culture that you can read about in this morning's newspapers. The Cameron government has announced that it's not going to apologize. It's not going to give an apology for essentially murdering one of the great mathematicians and scientists of the 20th century, Alan Turing, who, apart from being a major intellectual figure, also happened to be a war hero. He was crucially involved in decoding the German codes, something which saved Britain. They killed him, basically, drove him to suicide. Cameron, the prime minister, said they're not going to apologize because Turing broke the law. He was guilty of the crime of homosexuality, which is a violation of law. This should be a major scandal. I mean, I don't know how to describe it, but we'll see if it is. It isn't so far. Well, in the United States, for, say, research institutions like my own, MIT, the way the problem is being dealt with is by a shift to more corporate funding. And that has several effects. First of all, there's more emphasis on short-term applied work. So funding from, say, the Pentagon or the NIH, they're concerned with the long-term future of the advanced economy. That, incidentally, means also the profitability of the corporate sector long afterwards. So you develop computers and the internet for a couple of decades, and it ends up being profitable for the private corporations that feed off it. That's the socializing costs, privatizing profit principle. Well, that's government funding, Pentagon funding, for example. Very free, best funder there is. I was funded by them for a long time. In contrast, a business firm typically wants something it can use, not its competitors, and it wants to be able to use it tomorrow. I don't know of a careful study, but it appears that the shift towards corporate funding, in fact, does lead to more short-term applied research and less exploration of what might turn out to be interesting and valuable for the longer-term future. And another consequence of the shift from, say, Pentagon funding to corporate funding is more secrecy. During the Pentagon-funded era at MIT, I happen to be in a faculty student committee which examined it carefully, decades of Pentagon funding, there was no secrecy on campus. One exception was the political science department, but in the sciences there was no secrecy, literally true. They were involved in the Vietnam War, so none in the physics department, engineering departments, nowhere else. That's not true today. Corporate funders of course, cannot force secrecy, but they have an indirect way of doing it. They can threaten non-renewal of contracts. That's led to some scandals, some of them severe enough to have landed on the front page of the Wall Street Journal involving MIT. Corporatization can also have a considerable influence in other ways. Corporations, by their nature, focus on profit making. That's what they're for. And they seek to convert as much of life as possible into commodities. There's a lot to say about this topic in no time, but one particular consequence is the focus on what's called efficiency. Now, efficiency is not a simple economic concept. It has quite crucial ideological dimensions. So, for example, if a business reduces personnel, it becomes more efficient by standard measures with lower costs, but quite typically that shifts a burden to the public. It's a very familiar phenomenon. And the costs to the public are not counted. That's not a choice based on economic theory, but ideology. And that applies directly to the business models for the university. Increasing class size, using cheap temporary labor instead of full-time faculty, graduate students, for example, and other measures like that may look good on university budgets, but significant costs are transferred to the students and to the society generally as the quality of instruction is affected. There's furthermore no way to measure the human and the social costs of converting the schools and universities into facilities that produce commodities for the job market, abandoning the traditional ideal of the universities, encouraging creative and independent thought and inquiry, challenging received beliefs, exploring new horizons free of external constraints. It's an ideal that's undoubtedly been flawed in practice, but nevertheless it is a kind of a measure of the level of civilization achieved. Well, there are related consequences for the K-12. There's a major assault on the public schools underway, and the main reason is the new spirit of the age. Public schools are based on a very dangerous principle. They're based on the principle that we care about one another. So it's in violation of the new spirit of the age. So me, for example, I don't happen to have kids in the schools anymore, obviously, so why should I pay taxes? I mean, I'm not getting anything out of it. So therefore, let's get rid of public schools and just do things for ourselves. The attack on Social Security has pretty much the same roots. It's based on the principle that you're supposed to care about the disabled widow across town. You're supposed to care if she doesn't have food to eat, say. There are various, so why should I care? I'm doing fine. There are various pretexts offered, but they collapse very quickly on examination. The real source of these attacks on just humane public values and public goods, I think, is the passionate effort to instill this hateful and destructive principle, this new spirit of the age, from going on for 150 years, and long before that, the attack on the commons. And that instilling it has enormous profits to concentrated private power, very harmful to human effects. There's a related campaign to destroy those parts of the educational system that enrich the lives of students and enable them to follow the string that's laid out for them in the Enlightenment vision of education. That interferes with indoctrination, with control, with imposing passivity and obedience, with subordination to the principle of caring only about oneself. A major struggle about that right here, as you know better than I do, the destruction of the flourishing Mexican-American Studies program, and even even the removal from classrooms of books that are used in that program. This is becoming a national scandal, incidentally. Classics like Paulo Freire, The History of Chicanos, and the Mexican Civil Rights Movement. Books like Rethinking Columbus, even Shakespeare's Tempest. This is all reminiscent of precedents that we don't like to think about, but they're worth thinking about. And it's particularly dramatic that it's happening right here in the midst of what could properly be called occupied Mexico, conquered in you all know, I don't have to go into it, it was conquered in a brutal war of aggression. Well, I don't know any simple answers to the dilemmas that constantly arise in trying to develop and sustain an educational system of independence and integrity, one that strives for the Enlightenment ideal, and to do this within societies that are dominated by concentrations of power with very different values and goals. But at least one thing seems clear enough. Efforts to do this cannot progress very far in isolation from much broader struggles to protect what has already been achieved, and a lot has been achieved, from severe ongoing attacks, and to carry them forward towards a world of greater freedom and justice. Thanks.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. As we get ready for the question and answer part of our program tonight, reminder, we only have about 30 minutes for this. And I can imagine a lot of you, if you had paper as I do, would have a lot of notes and a lot of questions and a lot of comments for Professor Chomsky. So as we get into this question and answer, let me lay out some ground rules, some housekeeping, if you will. We have 2 microphones in the aisle. We'll alternate back and forth. As Dr. Jones mentioned at the beginning, make sure you respect